So welcome to the EBRD. I have to say this is rarely have we had a book event that attracted so many people. Very gratifying. My name is Larry Sherwin. I'm in the Communications Department. And welcome to this evening's discussion of Anne Applebaum's new book entitled Red Famine. Ms. Applebaum, as you know, is a journalist, a commentator, a prize-winning author of several other books, including Gulag, A History, which won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. She will be in conversation with Mr. Ed Lucas, who is a senior editor at The Economist magazine.
But I'm going to kick off by asking Anne about Red Famine, and particularly about the, rather long word, but rather an important one, the historiography of the famine, because your book isn't just about this extraordinary and not very well known, at least in the West, episode of state-sponsored mass murder. It's also about the way in which that story has been understood, misunderstood, lied about, understated, overstated, and so on. So explain where Red Famine fits into the historiography, into the other histories and the other understanding of the Ukrainian Holodomor.
Well, first of all, thank you for asking me an interesting question, one that will take me 2 seconds to think about rather than otherwise. And I also want to express my great gratitude to the Ukrainian Institute and to the EBRD for hosting this. I'm grateful to see you all here. So Red Famine is very consciously a part of the historiography of the famine. And it's in part an answer to a series of absences. So the famine, as some of you will know, and as if you don't know, you need to buy my book and have it explained to you. But the famine took place in 1932 and 1933. The Ukrainian famine was a smaller part. Well, it was a large part, actually. Sorry, but it took place during a wider famine. So there was a wider period of famine in the Soviet Union that was sparked by Stalin's decision to collectivize the peasantry, which began in 1929. And that decision, which I explain in the book, I explain the reasons for it and why it happened and how it happened. But it led to an enormous amount of chaos and food shortages and hardship all across the Soviet Union. But there was a moment in the autumn of 1932, really the height of this chaos and difficulty, when Stalin made a series of decisions and the Politburo passed a series of orders which heightened and deepened the famine very specifically in Ukraine. And until quite recently, really, until the Soviet archives were published and until people until historians had had time to go through them, the sequence of that decision-making wasn't known. And for a very, very long time, Ukrainians knew that the famine had been, their interpretation was that it was directed at them because they remembered how it had unfolded. So again, this was not a famine that happened because of bad weather. It wasn't because of insects. It wasn't a natural catastrophe. It happened because Stalin took these decisions, and then those had very concrete effects in Ukraine. And the famine was exacerbated and carried out by people by teams of activists who went from house to house, from village to village, and actually confiscated people's food. There was then a cordon drawn around Ukraine that prevented people from leaving the country, leaving the republic as it then was, and prevented peasants also from traveling from the villages into the cities. So it was a set of decisions that were taken to prevent people from getting food, and those decisions were taken in the autumn and winter, and then by the spring, people began to die in very large numbers. And as I said, Ukrainians remembered this. But nobody else ever remembered it. After the famine, while the famine was taking place, news of it you were not allowed to write about it or speak about it. Western journalists who were based in Moscow had some inkling that there was famine going on, but they were explicitly told not to transmit reports or write anything about it. Those who did do so were often even shouted down by other journalists who knew that they needed to keep their jobs in Moscow and their positions, and therefore they kept up this Soviet myth that there was no famine, or anyway there was a little bit of hunger but no starvation. And even in the 2 or 3 years that followed, the Soviet system made enormous efforts to cover up the famine, even going to the extent of the census that was taken in 1937. So, big census taken in 1937, and it showed too many people were missing in Ukraine. Stalin concealed that census. The next census was published in 1939, and it had manipulated numbers. So a lot of effort went into covering up the famine. And the cover-up held, and actually it held throughout most of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s in the Soviet Union. But it was always undermined by a kind of counter-narrative. And the Ukrainians, both in Ukraine, but most notably outside of Ukraine, the Ukrainian diaspora in Western Europe and the United States, kept up the memory of the famine. And they published books. They were very often very amateurish. They were oral history books and memoirs, and they published collections of memories and stories about the famine, which appeared in the Ukrainian community, and they were written about sometimes by the diaspora. But it was never, but the stories were never really believed. You know, the idea that a state, you know, that a leader, even a leader like Stalin, would deliberately starve people, that he would deprive people of food in order to kill them, seemed for many people something that it just couldn't be believed. And it wasn't really until the 1980s when when you began to get some movement in Ukraine and you began to get some reporting from Ukraine that it began to be a little bit possible to speak about it. And really the first couple of books about the famine published in the West were published at that time. And the most famous book was one by Robert Conquest. It was published in 1983. But Conquest based his book on those Ukrainian memoirs that I've spoken of, on newspaper reports and evidence from the time, on the work of some journalists who had kept records. And he wrote a book which came out to sort of, I wouldn't say great acclaim because it was controversial, but certainly a lot of attention was paid to it. Almost immediately, there was an enormous Soviet attack on the book. There was a counter book that was published called Fraud, Famine, and Fascism that sought to undermine Conquest. He was a CIA agent. It said all the material in the book came from Nazi sources, that that this was a fraud, this wasn't a true story. And almost since then, since the 1980s, every time the famine has come up as a story or as a piece of history, there has been a counterattack. Certainly there was initially a counterattack from the Soviet Union, and later the Russian government decided that it too also wanted to undermine the story of the famine. And so that's a roundabout way of saying that the actual, even the existence and the story of what happened have been controversial and have been suppressed since they happened, and right up to and including into modern times. Once Ukraine became independent in 1991, the Ukrainians themselves began to work on the history of the famine. They began to tell the story of the famine. They did work on the archives, much of which I've used in my book. Other people had the archival record had been established before. My book explains that and adds more material. But the government began to commemorate it. They began to speak about it. It became part of a conversation about the history of Ukraine. And almost the whole time, there's been a kind of a pushback from Russian authorities, from Russian historians, and from others who sought to question this idea that it really happened. And as I was going to say, up to and including the present, the Ukrainian government has built famine memorials in different parts of the country, and some of them in eastern Ukraine have been defaced during the recent war. So it has become a kind of political football, unfortunately. And one of the things my book seeks to do is to put at least some of that to rest. In other words, by saying, here's what we know, here's the collected evidence by a generation now of historians, here's the archival record, here's the oral history record, here's what we think happened.
I think it's very interesting that you mentioned Robert Conquest, who was working basically from emigre sources, that he had no access to Soviet sources, and he did basically get it right. And this huge spasm, it was one of the last great spasms of Soviet propaganda. I was working on the Soviet Union at the time, and I remember this counterattack and this attempt to try and paint black as white. And I think it's very interesting the way that if you go through your footnotes, you've got all these survivor testimony, all this stuff that was available before, And you've backed it up again and again with archival evidence, and it shows that what was dismissed as the sort of extreme ravings of embittered fascist emigres and their sort of Cold Warrior champions like Conquest was pretty much bang on right. If anything, they slightly underestimated it.
It was right. I mean, specifying the numbers has been a big deal, and actually the numbers have ranged from 2 million dead to 10 million dead, and we now have had a team of Ukrainian demographers who've gone through the archives, looked at not at the census material, but at birth and death material that we know to be from other sources to be accurate, and they have established it. So, there are things that Conquest didn't have and couldn't have had. But yeah, no, the outline of the story has been available for a long time. It's just been, but I think the archives solidify it, they clarify it. Stalin's motivations are a little bit clearer now too.
Well, I wanted to get onto that because this is one of the many sort of points that's made to try and blur and diminish the story of the Ukrainian famine, is the idea that this was just part of a sort of terrible failed experiment, or if you're really enthusiastic, a very costly experiment that was going on all over the Soviet Union, and it's just those self-centered Ukrainians who are trying to make out that they were at the center of the story. Actually, it was just a general Soviet catastrophe and nothing particularly Ukrainian about it. And I think you nail that very well by getting into Stalin's decision-making. And can you explain why he had such an animus, particularly against Ukraine?
So this goes back to the why Marina Pezzenti is so interested in this question of 1917. Actually, when I was writing the book, one of my initial my previous books were multi-year, in some cases multilingual, lots of different countries. And one of the advantages I thought of writing about the Ukrainian famine, well, it's only 2 years in one country. That keeps it quite straight. But actually, as I began to work on this subject, I realized that it was impossible to explain the famine without going back to 1917. Which was the year, of course, of the Bolshevik Revolution, but it was also the year of the Ukrainian National Revolution. So as Tsarism fell apart in Ukraine, a group of intellectuals came to power who, for a brief period, tried to create a Ukrainian state. It was not, eventually it declared independence from Russia, and it had the idea that there would be a sovereign Ukraine that would be its own country, much as in that period there were Poland was being recreated, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. There were lots of new countries being created on the back of collapsed empires, and Ukraine wanted to be one of those countries. That didn't happen, and it didn't happen because of the white armies, which did not want to see an independent Ukraine, and they came back in the country and fought with the Ukrainian troops, the Ukrainian forces, but more importantly because of the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks were one of their primary military goals during the Civil War, which lasted from 1917 through 1920-21, was to reoccupy Ukraine. And there were 3 attempts to occupy Ukraine, and 2 of them failed. And the second occupation failed very spectacularly. In 1918, the Bolsheviks came in for the second time. They tried to conquer Kiev. And what happened, and they ran the country for a short period of time, and the effect of their running the country, in which they brought in the Cheka, their secret police, they began nationalizing industry, they began taking over the state, and the effect of it was a massive peasant rebellion on a scale that I think hasn't happened in Europe any time before or since. And the Bolsheviks remembered this rebellion. It was anarchic, it was chaotic, it was sort of left-wing and anti-Bolshevik at the same time. So it was the Ukrainian peasants were in favor of land redistribution. They had very radical revolutionary slogans, and they were extremely anti-Bolshevik as well. And the memory of this rebellion, which led to a period of terrible chaos in Ukraine, I think the city of Kiev changed hands something like 12 times in 1919. And at one point, that allowed the white armies to come back, the Polish army came back, but their memory of this chaos and the memory of the fear that it caused was something that stayed with the Bolsheviks for a long time, so much so that they continued to write about it. And I think Trotsky spoke about the terrible lesson of 1918 and 1919. And years later, Stalin would refer back to this period of chaos. And they were afraid of both of the power of Ukrainian I have to be careful how I use the word nationalism, because it was more than, it wasn't just nationalism in the modern sense, but the Ukrainian national movement, the idea of Ukrainian sovereignty, the idea that it should be a separate country that would challenge Bolshevism, it would present an alternative political model. They were afraid of that, and they were afraid of the Ukrainian peasantry, whom they suspected of being anti-Bolshevik, and they were probably right. And so with this constant fear that it would happen again was something that's with the Bolsheviks, and again, you can see it in memoirs and archives and so on. And when Stalin conducted collectivization in 1929, even before he did it, there was a good deal of fear. How are the Ukrainians going to react? There needs to be special attention paid to Ukraine. And then, of course, the reaction was, as he expected, an enormous pushback. In Ukraine, there was armed rebellion. People, as anticipated, went to their barns. They got the guns they'd stored there from the Civil War, and they got them out, and they started shooting at commissars. And this specter of chaos in Ukraine and rebellion in Ukraine was at the forefront of Stalin's mind and his imagination, and this was what he wanted to stop. And at that kind of height of the food crisis in 1929, he saw that this was the opportunity to do it. And it's important to note that the famine was half the story. You know, the famine was, as I said, it was orchestrated. There were teams of people who went and took people's food away. But at the same time, he also conducted a kind of mass arrest and series of purges of the Ukrainian national intelligentsia. So there was the famine, and then at the same time, they got rid of the Ukrainian artists, writers, curators, history professors, and also the Ukrainian Communist Party were thoroughly purged also in 1933 and continue into 1934. And this kind of two-pronged movement was designed to eliminate this problem of Ukraine, this idea of Ukraine as a competitor for the Bolsheviks.
I think it's very useful that you've unpicked it like that, because I think many people may have got at the back of their minds that grim phrase of Stalin's, the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. And it's easy to conflate that with the mass famine. And
They happened together. I mean, so the elimination of the kulaks and the attack on the peasantry did pave the way for what happened in Ukraine, and it built up the kind of anger and animus, and it was part of the propaganda that was needed to convince people. Remember, Stalin had to convince people to go into peasant houses and confiscate food. Yeah. And the background, this hysteria about the kulaks and the peasants who are trying to undo the revolution, and the enemies of the people and the enemies of the state, and all that's an important background to the story. That's part of why it happened. But you're right, it's a slightly separate story from a set of decisions that were taken inside Ukraine.
I was giving a talk the other day about this at a school, and a hand went up and someone said, why didn't they call the police? Which is, in a way, an absurd question, but it is interesting to think what must have been going through the minds of the Ukrainian communists and the Ukrainian NKVD, because the people they were starving would have been their fellow Ukrainians, fellow subjects of the Soviet Union, but also possibly family members, people, and there would have been personal connections there. And I think you explained very well in the book this sort of tremendous sense of sort of fear and divided loyalty that gripped the Ukrainian Communist Party.
So the Ukrainian Communist Party knew what was happening, and the leadership knew, and they of course read reports from the regions. Certainly in 1931 and 1932, they were raising the alarm. They began asking Moscow for food, and above all, they began saying, why? Because the famine originally began not just because of chaos, but also grain requisition. So they asked Stalin, could he lower the rate of grain requisition in Ukraine? And there is, again, in the spring of 1932, many of the leaders of the Ukrainian Communist Party begin writing to Stalin, a terrible thing is coming, disaster is heading our way, can you make it stop? And Stalin's reaction was to treat them with suspicion, and he wrote all kinds of angry letters to Kaganovich and to his other allies saying, these terrible Ukrainian communists, do we really trust them? I'm not sure they're really loyal. And he had terrible suspicions about the Ukrainian Communist Party being loyal. And actually, the Ukrainian Communist Party were, again, among the victims of this 1933-34 purge as well. So it was his attack was very focused on them. There was a point at which, in 33-34, they became kind of cowed, and and they understood that there would be no famine relief, and that they had no choice but to go along. One of them very spectacularly killed himself. I mean, so there were people who tried to prevent it and felt they couldn't, and committed suicide. There were a couple of people. But the drama inside the party was great, and afterwards it didn't improve. I mean, I think most of the Ukrainian communists who weren't arrested in 1934 were then arrested in 1937. There's like only a couple of exceptions. I mean, by the end of the decade, the whole party had been changed to people who were more reliably Stalinist. I mean, it's important to understand that the situation of the police is a little bit different. So the Soviet secret police were mixed. They would not all have been so-called ethnic Ukrainians. And the activist brigades that went from house to house were also mixed. And they had some of them would have been police, some of them would have been NKVD, OGPU as they then were. Some of them were activists from Russia. Some of them were activists from the cities, but some of them were local. So there were these local brigades that actually carried out the famine.
One of the great controversies, in a sense an artificial one, is the question of whether this was genocide or not. And again, it's one of the sort of rebuttals, which is a little bit familiar for those of us who look at the Turkish-Armenian thing, but something you get quite often from people on the sort of Russian side, is to say, yes, this was terrible, but it's wrong to call it genocide. It wasn't genocide, just as the Turks say that a lot of Armenians got killed, but it was a very tough time, very confusing. It wasn't genocide. But I think you unpick very neatly in the book the history of the term genocide and the way it both, in a way, simultaneously both applies and doesn't apply.
Yes, so I mean, ironically, the term genocide was invented by somebody who was born in what is today's Ukraine. It was then Poland. Raphael Lemkin was a Polish-Jewish lawyer who was from a town near Lviv, and the term genocide, he wrote in his unpublished memoirs, he wrote that his fascination with the whole subject and with this question of nationalist, nations trying to destroy other nations, of course, came from where he grew up and his knowledge of the history of that region. The term wasn't used legally until the 1940s. He wrote about it and spoke about it in the 1920s and afterwards, but it came into use during the Second World War, and of course it became a legal term after the Second World War in the context of the UN Convention on Genocide, which was a kind of after response to the Nuremberg massacres. Nuremberg trial. That would be something else, yes. The Nuremberg trial, when people felt the Nuremberg trial hadn't really answered all the questions, and the UN Convention on Genocide was supposed to solve some of the problem of mass international murder legally. Lemkin himself had a very clear definition. His idea of what genocide was exactly what Stalin did in Ukraine. In other words, it was the attempt to destroy a nation, its culture, its identity, its educational system, its religion, its churches. And he actually started at one point writing a kind of international history of genocide, in which he also talked about colonialism and Spanish attempts to eradicate tribes, and he had a very wide idea of what he meant by that. And he also wrote at one point a paper describing how the word genocide very much applied to Ukraine, and he specifically talked about Stalin's assault on Ukraine as being, in his mind, the classic definition of the word genocide. But as the word was translated into international law, it got a little more complicated. So the UN, as it was debating this in the late 1940s, of course, a major participant in those debates was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was very keen that the definition of genocide in UN treaties and the understanding of genocide not be applicable to anything that the Soviet Union had ever done. So the Soviet Union was very much involved in the creation of this legal term. And one of the things they did was to eliminate the word political, because the definition of genocide, I'm now not going to remember it by heart, but it's something like murder committed for religious, ethnic, cultural reasons, and the Soviet Union took it, and then the original definition had the word political as well. So that would have, of course, included the kulaks. It would have included all kinds of other mass murders carried out by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was also keen that the word be very much attached to what the Germans did, and that it be basically interpreted as the genocide is equivalent of the Holocaust. And because of that definition and Stalin's insistence and the Soviet Union's insistence on that term, it's become very difficult legally and internationally to use the term in a broader way, in the way that Lemkin meant. I really have no problem applying the term genocide to the Ukrainian famine, but I also, I really feel that, the point of my book was to establish the history and to establish exactly what happened. And the word genocide, I think, is a legal term and not a historical term. And my initial instinct was to write the book and then let other people decide how to apply the term. But I realized in the course of writing the book that part of this discussion of historiography had to be a description of what is genocide and does the famine meet the definition. So as I said, my conclusion was, it does. I wind up having to write about it, but it does meet the definition as Lemkin imagined it, and I think as we all kind of intuitively imagine it. We think of genocide as murdering people, not for something that they've done, but for who they are. And the Ukrainian famine was an attempt to murder people because they were Ukrainian, because they were in the way of Stalin's plans, because they were an ethnic and political group that was a problem for the Bolsheviks. And so in that sense, intuitively it fits. It gets more difficult to apply the term strictly legally, but that is, again, to do with the way that the term was written.
Good. Well, we've had about half an hour. We've got about 25 minutes to go, and I'd be very keen to get some questions from the audience. But before we, let me just ask, hands up everybody here who is Ukrainian or has Ukrainian connections. Good. Okay, you've all got to buy the book. That's very good. We've got a kind of 50% Ukrainian audience. But I also see some other faces here from countries which also experienced Stalinist terror in different ways and different times. So thank you. I should have said at the beginning, thank you all very much for coming. So if you want to ask questions, I think we've got a microphone here and there, and lots of questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work my way fairly methodically from this side of the room to that side of the room. So let's start off with hands here. There's a gentleman in the front row. First of all, look at a microphone going to him. Can you stand up, sir, and can you introduce yourself? And then the second, there's a gentleman who's there 3 rows back. He'll come next.
Yes. So,
can you hold the microphone and introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Denis Ugrin. I'm Ukrainian, so I'm in the 50% of the audience that is from Ukraine. I'm also a child psychiatrist by trade, and what I want to ask you about, it may take you more than 2 seconds to think about that question too, but have you ever thought about the impact of not just the famine, but oppression in general by different states on the mental health of the population?
Yes,
well, while Anne
I have thought about that.
Well, while Anne is turning her extensive thoughts on that into a fairly short answer, can you bring the microphone to the gentleman behind? Can you stand up, sir, so the lady can see you? Thank you. And then after that, the gentleman behind you. Go.
Thank you. Michael Elmer. In the years of the Cold War, particularly in the 50s and 60s, there was a program of Russian assassination of Ukrainians in the West, émigrés. Some of that perhaps was for reasons because they were generally opposed to Russian imperialism, atheistic communism. Is there any correlation between the victims and the degree to which they were trying to make known the facts of the famine?
Great. And then you just pass the microphone behind you to the gentleman with the spectacles there.
Hello, my name is Martin Pospisil. I come from the Czech Republic. My wife is from Ukraine, and her grandparents actually survived the famine. And the interesting thing was that for many decades, they didn't even know they went through a famine because of the Soviet propaganda. My question, well, first of all, thank you very much for this book, and thank you also to all the efforts that you put into understanding of my region. I really appreciate that. My question is, you at the beginning you describe all the sources that you went through and that you were able to access Kiev archives. Of course, you were not able to access the Russian archives. So my question to you, because many of them are still closed, my question to you would be, to what extent you think your book might still be incomplete, or our understanding of what happened was incomplete, and what would be the key questions you would want to have answered?
Well,
thank you.
Obviously, I do a lot of these panels. These are cracking questions. Thanks very much. Please keep up the standard. Well,
We have to start answering them or I'm going to forget.
okay, so the first one is about child,
the
child psychiatrist.
So, I'll actually start with the last one because it's actually not true that we don't have access to Russian archives. I worked a lot in Russian archives in the 1990s in Moscow, and other people did too. And the archival record of Stalin's decision making, which was in Moscow, but there would have been echoes of it and repeats of it in other archives, I think is established. I mean, it's not; those are records that were found in 20 years ago. So I don't think that there could be a few things missing. There could be some personal documents missing in which he writes of it. I actually don't think on this particular story, this particular narrative, that there's that much missing. The Russian archives are known. They were examined. A lot of people worked in them. The closing of the archives is something that's happened more recently. And even now, a lot of Russian historians are still able to get into them, even if foreign historians aren't.
We luckily microfilmed them all and took them to the Hoover Institution.
Yes, we microfilmed some of them, not all of them, but yes, there were some that were taken to Hoover. But so I don't think actually on that score there's a problem. And by the way, the Ukrainian archives are among the most easy to use and accessible in Europe. I mean, you can sort of walk in with you barely need an ID to use them. I mean, it's a remarkably open archival system. So. And remember that they have all of their party records, and their party records include Moscow party records and so on. So there's really actually, my problem was never, with this book, was never lack of information. There was actually always way too much. The assassinations in the 1950s and 60s, I don't know the answer to that. The Soviet Union was bothered by all kinds of people, and I don't know that the famine was a particular. I mean, generally speaking, people who kept records of the Soviet Union or were interested in Soviet history had problems with the Soviet authorities all the way through, and that included both emigres and non-emigres. But I don't know whether there was anything specifically connected to the famine. The story about the question about child psychiatry. I mean, of course, this is a huge question, and people have thought about this in the context of the Holocaust. They've thought about it in the context of all kinds of other mass murders and terrible political events. And the answer is yes, of course it affects people. And of course it affects subsequent generations. Ukrainians themselves have often, sought to understand, how did the famine shape our mentality as a nation? I mean, does it explain, there's a kind of not apolitical, but there's a very, to this day in Ukraine, there's always been a feeling that, the state, if you work for the state or state institutions, that's something else. The real Ukraine is somewhere in the villages, in our apartments, in our cities. And Ukrainians are fantastically good at organizing what we now call civil society. They're good at organizing themselves away from and apart from the state. But this feeling that government authorities, that the state is somehow something alien, problematic, and therefore corrupt, is something that I think probably dates back to that era. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just going to say we need to answer these brilliant questions more briefly if we're going to get all of them in.
Okay, well then, yes.
Very good, the ideal answer. Okay, let's have some hands up over there. Okay, there's the lady in the front in the pale blue shirt is next, and then the gentleman in the middle. Do you want to stand up? Thanks.
Thank you. Ursula Woolley, UCL, and the Ukrainian Institute. You spoke very briefly at the beginning of the session about the involvement of key Western foreign correspondents in covering the story, managing the story at the time of the famine. Can you tell us a bit more about that process and the lovely story in the book of John Hughes's governess's son and how he was
Gareth Jones.
Yes, kept quiet.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And let's just have the gentleman there in the middle, if you stand up, sir.
Tony Palmer. I have an observation and 2 footnotes. First, I want to thank you for an absolutely astonishingly wonderful book. Nobody said that. You must all read it. Go buy it and read it.
You're hereby absolved from my thing about only one question.
Not least because it helps us understand what is happening in the Ukraine today. That's the really important value of the book. My observation is that, for reasons which are not important, I'm a visiting professor at a university in western Ukraine, Lutsk. My inaugural lecture, oddly enough, was in Lviv at the Catholic University to which the lady referred. And this is a few years ago now, but not that long ago, I know, I'm going to be brief. And I gave the lecture about Lemkin, who you've cited, but also Lauterpacht, who was the other really remarkable lawyer coming from that area, who coined the phrase crimes against humanity, as you know. And I asked this very distinguished group of academics at my inaugural lecture, who has heard of Lemkin? This is in Lviv. Who has heard of Lemkin or Lauterpacht? Not a single hand went up. So my question is, you cite endless contemporary sources in your book, quite rightly so, but don't you think that the Ukrainians today are completely unaware of the significance of what happened, or even the fact that it did happen?
Thank you very much.
Two footnotes, I'm allowed two footnotes? Yes, yes, musical footnotes. First is, I'm sure you're aware that the reason that Stravinsky left Russia was that he had estates in western Ukraine. And when he was in Paris, he vowed that he would never go back as a result of the uprising. Secondly, I once asked Robert Conquest, who I knew, where did you get the phrase, the harvest of sorrow? And he looked at me and he said, but you, as a musician, or quite part-time musician, you should know this, that it was the title of the very first song that Rachmaninoff ever wrote. And he thought Rachmaninoff would appreciate the irony of that.
Very good. Well, thank you. I don't regret giving you the extra time, but please, that didn't set a precedent. Two very good points. First of all, please blast Walter Durante and praise Gareth Jones. And secondly, the Ukrainian, one of the absences is perhaps there are no Lemkin streets or Loudonov statues where perhaps there should be.
So there were two one of them was famous at the time, and one of them is more famous now. But there were two journalists who one wrote about the famine and one didn't in Ukraine in the 1930s, and their interactions and their story is a central part of a chapter in the book which talks precisely about Western reactions and Western understanding of what went on. And the one who is now become, and it's very interesting actually, how their historical reputations have shifted. One of them was extremely famous at the time, and this was famously Walter Durante, who was the New York Times correspondent in Moscow. He was kind of the dean of the Moscow press corps. His articles were famous all over the world, and particularly in New York. He was so influential that Roosevelt sought to meet with him and speak to him. He was really, for the number of years he was there, it was nearly a decade that he was there, he was really the main interpreter of the Soviet Union to Americans. And so he was really, it's hard to underestimate how important he was. And one of the favors he did for the regime in exchange for being allowed to live there, for having best access of anybody. By the way, people have looked for evidence that he was had some arrangement with the secret police. Nobody's found it, but I'm not even sure that would have been necessary. But simply for being able to stay there and do his job, he very actively suppressed the story of the famine. He wrote a very famous piece the title was "Russians are hungry but not starving." So he may have felt, in order to hold up his own reporting, he needed to make sure that nobody thought he'd gotten collectivization wrong. The other journalist was Gareth Jones, who was indeed the grandson of, this is a complicated one, but John Hughes was a Welsh industrialist who founded the city which is now known as Donetsk and used to be known as Husovka. Okay? And his nanny was the mother of Gareth Jones, who was a young man who grew up in Wales but did Russian and German at Cambridge, had some connection to Lloyd George. He was Lloyd George's secretary after his retirement, and went to Moscow in 1933. I think he got his visa on the basis that he was Lloyd George's secretary, but actually he went because he wanted to write, and did the amazingly brave thing of getting an agreement from the Russian Foreign Ministry to go to Kharkiv, which was then the capital of Ukraine, and took the train from Moscow to Kharkiv and actually got off the train about 100 miles north of Kharkiv and walked. And he walked along the train tracks. And that meant that he was walking through actually the worst hit part of Ukraine, because the famine was the worst in Kharkiv and Kiev provinces, the worst hit part of Ukraine in the middle of the famine. This is in sort of March 1933. And he was eventually picked up by the Soviet secret police, who took him to angrily took him to his hotel in Kharkiv. But he took notes. He kept a very extensive notebook, and the notebooks are now published. And then he left the Soviet Union, wrote several articles, and actually held a press conference in Berlin in which he said, "There's enormous famine happening in Ukraine. It's a terrible disaster and a tragedy." Durante wrote a piece directly in response to this, saying it's all very well for this young Welshman to, he's very enthusiastic, and it's nice that he's gone to the trouble of learning Russian, but actually he's missed the story and he's wrong. And of course, Durante was then the famous, establishment journalist, and Gareth Jones was, 28-year-old Welshman, and so Durante won that argument. In the years since, Gareth Jones actually died a couple of years after that in a very strange accident. He was in Mongolia, where he was doing further reporting. But his story has been revitalized and remembered, and there are Gareth Jones documentaries, and his notebooks have been published, and his star has risen, and his reputation is now as this really extraordinary young crusading journalist who wrote these very passionate articles and did this passionate press conference in Berlin about the famine. He actually has a kind of status even inside Ukraine as somebody who's remembered for telling the story. So that's the story of the Western press. I mean, there's more to the story in the book as well, but those are the two most interesting journalists. Why isn't Lemkin better known in Ukraine? There was actually a book on Lemkin and Lauterpacht that was written, which you probably know, by Philippe Sands. It was published last year, which got lots of attention. I think won the Booker Prize, not the Booker Prize, the Samuel Johnson Prize, as it then was. And actually, the author of that book has said that he's now doing some kind of program promoting the memory of Lemkin inside Ukraine. But one interesting thing about Lemkin is his name wasn't just lost in Ukraine. His name was sort of lost more generally. He wasn't well known in Poland, which is where he's from, and he had some Polish government jobs, and he wrote and spoke in Polish, also until within the last decade. And so the revival of Lemkin and his memory and what was the history of the idea of genocide, I think, is something that started here and is now moving to Ukraine. So it may be that changes in the next decade.
So we've got time for a couple more questions. The gentleman at the back there, and a couple of questions down here. Let's go. Quick fire questions, please.
Yeah, it's a very simple question. My name is Philippe Belot. I have no connection to Ukraine. My question is, let's say if I was a farmer in Ukraine at that time, and if I did not resist collectivization, so in other terms, if I joined the collective farm, would I save my life and that of my family? Thank you.
You answered that while the microphone's coming down to the front.
The answer is it depends. It's certainly one of the effects of the famine after it was finished was that everybody joined the collective farms. I mean, that was the famine ended any remaining resistance. And certainly there were people who joined the collective farms hoping to save themselves. However, the famine wasn't caused by, just by the process of collectivization. It was also the confiscation of food. And the confiscation of food did happen to people who who were part of collective farms as well. Because this was there was a requisitioning process. People were meant to give over their food to the state. And you would not necessarily save yourself. Of course, that was, the desire to save yourself was, of course, why people collaborated with the activist teams and with collectivization process. And so some people tried. But no, the answer is no, not necessarily. And the food shortages were so great and so widespread that they actually affected collective farm bosses and collective farm managers and all kinds of people who were collaborating in some ways.
The gentleman in the front, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Nikolai Kravitz, and one of the things you mention in your book is that the famine shows that Ukraine has a separate history to that of Russia. And you also mentioned the executed Renaissance. And I was wondering, would it be right to say that the Ukrainian intelligentsia of the 1930s was fundamentally different from the Russian intelligentsia because it was based on sort of a desire to understand Ukraine better. So is it therefore closer to the intelligentsia of Poland or Czechoslovakia of that period, therefore highlighting a further difference to that of Russia and Ukraine?
Let's have we're going to take a whole bunch and then stop. So the gentleman behind.
All right, but then I'll forget them. So.
I'll remember. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Bohdan Vitvitsky. Ma'am, you've talked about pushback from the Soviet government and more recently from Russia, which is understandable in some sense politically, but there also seems to be some pushback from Western academia as represented, let's say, by the exchange you have with Sheila Fitzpatrick. I mean, leaving aside personalities, do you have any understanding of why there continues to be some pushback on the part of Western academia?
Okay, 2 quick questions, 2 quick answers.
Sheila Fitzpatrick, who is actually, I think, a great historian in a lot of ways. She has a tremendous, is compiled amazing material and so on. Sheila Fitzpatrick's original book on peasantry very much downplayed the idea that there was an intentional famine, and she's argued against it for many years. And she's, as you know, is part of a revisionist. This is somebody, by the way, who reviewed my book in an odd way. Basically, the review said, well, there's some very interesting book, too bad about Anne Applebaum. It was something like that was the tone. But she, this is the revisionist school of history was sought for a long time to portray Stalinism as something normal. In other words, it's a different form of modernization. It's a mistake to use the term totalitarianism to talk about it. There were multiple centers of power, which is actually not entirely untrue, but they've had a lot of trouble since the Soviet archives were published, because these books were all published before the archives were available. And some of them, not all of them, have had trouble adjusting to the archives, which have tended to underline the idea that it was a totalitarian country, it wasn't normal, and it wasn't a normal kind of modernization. So I looked on that piece of her review, which seemed kind of grudging. I thought that was trying to hold up the value of her previous work. She wrote a book about Stalin's peasants, which didn't talk about the famine.
To be fair to The Guardian, they did publish my letter a week later pointing out how bad her review was.
Right. Anyway, I don't want to, I don't.
And the question on the intelligentsia?
So, yes, of course the Ukrainian intelligentsia was different from the Russian intelligentsia. I mean, in that, it had a different background and a different life experience, and people who were, to say, even in the 1920s and 30s, that you're a Ukrainian and to speak and use Ukrainian was a gesture of a certain kind. I mean, you would have had to be somebody who would have actively resisted Russification, because Russification was a big part of Tsarist culture. And the Bolsheviks, again, wanted to Russify Ukraine. So yes, there was a different mentality to being a Ukrainian intellectual in the 20s and 30s, just like there is now. I mean, there's also a different mentality to being Polish or, Lithuanian or British. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that Ukrainians and Russians are somehow fundamentally different, but of course the nature of, what it meant to be Ukrainian in the 20s, and what it would have taken to read and write and publish in Ukrainian meant that you had to be thinking differently from the way people were thinking in Moscow. So yeah, it was a different. There's
another interesting related question about the difficulty that the Russian liberal intelligentsia sometimes has in equating their liberal-mindedness with an acceptance that Ukraine's a country, but that's perhaps a question for another.
That's a problem that persists to this day. And you can see it again in this period as well. I mean, one of the tragedies of the Civil War era is that the Russian liberals and the right armies never sought to make common cause with the Ukrainians, because had they done so, either the Ukrainians or the Poles, but had they done so, had they agreed to the breakup of the empire, they might have been able to defeat the Bolsheviks together. But those divisions, they were never able to understand that these were separate countries.
Now, we started a few minutes late, and we'll finish even fewer, a small number of minutes late. There was a lady there with white hair. I think you're the last question, ma'am. Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Hold the microphone, please, and introduce yourself.
I'm sorry. Raisa Roy. I am from Ukraine. Well, I was born in Ukraine. I've been living in this country for the last 21 years. My parents and grandparents, they survived Holodomor or famine. I just wanted to ask you very sort of to extend personal question. Have you been to Kiev, to Bykivnya, where a lot of people buried there?
To the cemetery. To the cemetery.
Yeah.
Not recently, but yes.
It's incredible.
Yes.
And thank you very much for your book. It's really inciting and very interesting and very easy reading. And I also wanted to use this microphone and to advise the people in this auditorium to read the book of James Mace,
Yes.
The People of Truth. I noticed that you used one of his first sort of work. It's not just a book, but work on...
James Mace is another interesting character in this historiography story, because James Mace was an American academic who worked with Robert Conquest and who did an enormous amount of research. He was a kind of expert on Ukraine before it was fashionable, and helped Bob Conquest write Harvest of Sorrow.
Right, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
On that note, I just have one final thing I want to do is hands up everyone who's already bought Anne's book here. Right, well, that is no excuse for not buying another copy, because you now know how good it is, and you must give it its ideal Christmas presents and things like that. And hands up everybody who hasn't bought Anne's book. Right, well, then you know what you have to do, and I've just given her a very nice pen. She'll be signing copies outside. Please join me in thanking Anne very much indeed.
Thank you, Edward.